Hey everyone, and welcome to Suburban Stone Age. It is midsummer, and we have just wrapped up an intensive session of setting up shelter at Minipoi and also delivering 4 of our IBC totes that are going to serve us as water tanks. So, having gone through that process, I wanted to share a few insights that I learned in survival techniques and a few things that made me very sick and caught me off guard while I was doing this. Even though I was fully supported on these adventures, I had a running vehicle, I brought plenty of food and water, there was civilization nearby where I could call for help if I needed it. So I was what I would have thought was completely prepared for being out in an extreme desert environment, getting work done. But again, there were a few things that made me really sick and caught me off guard. And so I wanted to share those with you so that the next time that you plan a trip, whether it be for hiking or for work or whatever reason that you plan to spend time in an extreme heat environment like the Mojave Desert, that you see these subtle disadvantages ahead of time and aren't caught off guard like I was. Because even though I was fully supported, I became very sick, and that is a huge disadvantage when you're not fully supported. So here we go. The most important thing that I learned was that altitude matters. Now, Minipoi is only at 2,800 feet, but my home is at about 600 feet above sea level. So there is what I never really considered to be too much of an altitude change. When I think of high altitude, I think of 5,000 feet, 7,000 feet. If you Google it, it says, altitude. If you Google altitude sickness, it starts to give you numbers like 8,000, 9,000 feet, where people start to have what's recognized as altitude sickness. So with Minipoi being at only 2,800 feet, I didn't even think about that. Well, seeing as though it's July and very hot, also, I'm no spring chicken anymore. So maybe in the past, an altitude change to 2,800 or 3,000 feet wasn't that big of a deal. I found that this time, it was a real struggle. I was very low energy. I had to really push to do simple things that at home were no big deal, but up at high altitude turned out to be very strenuous. Everything took 3 times as long. And when you layer in the additional effort plus extreme heat, everything becomes very difficult. And if there's any time pressure on that, meaning you have to push for some reason, in my case, I was pushing to meet deadlines. I had to do certain things so that people coming could do their thing. However, in a survival situation, maybe your deadline is you need to get to a certain place where you think has water, and you have to do a physical push for that. You know you're tired, and you know it's hot out, but you got to make that push in order to get to somewhere safe. That is really going to cost you physically, and it cost me physically way more than I even considered. I had no idea, and I had plenty of water with me. I was aware of the heat, so I was drinking plenty of water. I was pacing myself as best I knew how. All these things that I thought I knew, still I ended up with heat exhaustion. Now, how do I know I got heat exhaustion and also altitude sickness? Well, I'm not a doctor, I'll say that right now, but the first time that it happened, there were some symptoms that I noticed that led me to start looking into this. First of all, and this happened about 12 hours after the event, so there's a delayed reaction here. But first of all, the first time, my hands became really swollen. And that was very odd. That had never happened before, but I could visibly tell that my hands were puffy. Now, this was also in addition to a really intense headache, which is not normal for me. That lasted a few days. Additionally, I was very low energy and I was exhausted. When I got home, I couldn't even drag myself out of bed for the whole rest of the day. All of these things seem to be much, much more severe of a consequence from having done this exertion than I had anticipated, especially because all the while I'd been taking care of myself and as best as I thought I knew how while I was in this extreme environment. But for the following day and for several days after, my body was puffy and swollen. Not just my hands, I could feel it even in my abdomen. Okay, and just think about that in a situation where you're not supported. Even if you get to the place you need to be safe, if for the next couple days even your body is acclimating to a new environment, you're going to be at a huge disadvantage. You'll be sick, which you may not have anticipated. I certainly didn't. And if I had been in an emergency, it would have definitely caught me off guard. And I view it as the same level of disadvantage as having an actual physical injury. It's just more sneaky to recognize because you don't see blood or broken bone. That's easy. You're like, I have an injury and this is what I have to deal with. This is very subtle and very sneaky, and you may never have thought of that before, and neither did I. So this happened actually after several events. Each time I went up, I tried something new. Some were more successful than others, and I think as time went on, my body did acclimate more and I recovered more quickly. And I learned that, I drank a gallon of water in one day while the shed was being installed, and I was just sitting and observing. I wasn't even working. But I was sitting in shade in 100-degree heat, not exerting myself, and drinking a ton of water, and I still got very sick. Well, that might have been an electrolyte imbalance. So even if you have water, maybe you run low on electrolytes, and that's where the headache and fatigue comes from. Like I say, I'm not a doctor, but these are all symptoms I'm noticing that are changing and feeding back into the way I think about being prepared in the future for a survival situation. Everybody says bring plenty of water, and that's very good advice, but also if you deplete yourself of electrolytes, that's another layer to think about that can impact you negatively and give you a big disadvantage. Second of all, again, altitude. Every time I went up to 2,800 to 3,000 feet, my body did acclimate. I feel a little bit better. So when I came back home, maybe the puffiness only lasted 2 days instead of 3, or the fatigue was bearable by the time I got home. So I feel that my body was responding and adapting. But that took a month. That took a month to do, of constantly revisiting this high altitude. I don't think my body could have adapted as quickly if I were in an emergency and I had to compress that time down to 3 or 4 days. I think I still would have been at a disadvantage because of altitude for that amount of time while my body was adjusting. So, to summarize, I just wanted to share with you my experience in a harsh environment and these little subtle things I learned that could impact you if you are in an emergency, because they certainly impacted me when I was not in an emergency, and I was extremely surprised by what happened and caught off guard. And I wanted to share this insight with you so that if you plan to be out in an adventure in an extreme environment in the future, you can keep this in mind, and if an emergency arises, or even just to have the best possible experience, you can take this into account and build preparation into your trip. Thanks for listening, and thanks for watching. We will see you again on the next video.